Round cube. Doesn't that spell CR? Kris and Susie's adventures in the dark world begin when the two are on the hunt for chalk in the school closet, only to notice that the vibes are way off. But before they can escape, the door slams shut and they are plunged into the unknown. For the longest time, I just assumed the door closing on them was simply done for dramatic effect. But after replaying what we have of Deltarune thus far a couple of more times, I'm convinced that someone deliberately trapped the two in there. That whoever did this is fully aware that there's a dark world and they wanted to kickstart the prophecy. But who could it be? And how will this reveal even impact the story of Deltarune? Well, let's start with the characters I don't think are responsible, which are the students. At first glance, a lot of them are reasonable suspects since they were all in close proximity to the closet. Plus, a version of the prophecy is taught through the church, so it's not impossible for one of the students to connect the fabled heroes to Kris and Susie. Hell, one of these heroes is said to have horns, and Kris used to wear fake horns. Obviously, the prophecy is referring to Rousey, but the church wouldn't know that. Yet every student has at least one thing that rules them out as the door slammer. Noelle and Bertley are clearly out of the loop about Dark Worlds and still believe that the events of Chapter 2 were a dream. Caddy with an eye mic makes sense, given that she and Kris have a history in the occult, attempting to summon a demon at one point, and she has access to the church's version of the prophecy through her big sister. In a game full of characters who know more than they're letting on, it tracks that a childhood friend of Kris, who has some familiarity with black magic and rituals, would be aware of Dark Worlds and suspect that Kris is one of the heroes in the prophecy. Hell, with everything we know now about Kris and their sketchy alliances, I wouldn't be surprised if they were in on getting trapped in the closet. But Caddy hates Susie. Like, hates her. There's no shot she thinks Susie is one of the heroes. In fact, if she did know something about the prophecy, then her insistence to keep Susie away from Noelle doesn't bode well for anyone, especially because we know tragedy is in store for Susie. I think Caddy would try to keep Susie out of the dark world if she knew something was afoot. The rest of the class is terrified of Susie, so I doubt they'd view her as a hero or want to risk slamming the door on her. Plus, Jockington doesn't have arms. Ruling out all the students doesn't rule out everyone in the classroom though, as we also have Alphys, who is sus as fuck, and way too many people overlook her role in the story. I feel like a lot of Deltarune fans have accepted this version of Alphys as a dorky teacher who's out of her depth with nothing else going on whatsoever, which is wild to me because all the other returning main characters from Undertale aren't that different from their original counterparts. Asgore is still someone who's desperately clinging onto the past and acts on emotion rather than logic, taking things to extremes regardless of what his conscience says. Also, all signs point to him being a king in his dark world, just like how Toriel is a queen. Toriel being a character who has an identical personality in both games, aside from being initially overprotective of Frisk by trying to keep them in the ruins. Undyne's pretty similar in both games, minus her prejudice towards humans as she overcomes in Undertale. She still retains her immense strength and even has access to her magic spears in the dark world, going from the chief of police to a knight. Sans is almost definitely from Deltarune, so he's literally the same person. I'm convinced that Undertale Alphys and Deltarune Alphys have a lot more in common beyond being a weeb with low self-esteem who has impossibly large shoes to fill. I believe her super intelligence, her affiliation with Asgore, and her desire to be valued, to be a part of something greater, will all play a role in future chapters of this game. I'm confident that Alphys is well aware of Dark Worlds because 1, a nerd like her would totally find an alternate reality that could bring all of her anime babes to life, and 2, she has a handful of dialogue throughout the game that I think alludes to her knowing more than she lets on. In Chapter 2, she tells Susie to treat school property like she treat people. The first time around, you're definitely supposed to read this as Alphys being a concerned teacher who wants to minimize any damages that come out of her paycheck. But after the game makes it clear that the Dark Worlds personify inanimate objects, it feels like Alphys was being very particular with her wording. In Chapter 4, she gets anxious when asked about the bunker, suggesting that what's in there might be worse than whatever disaster would force people to seek shelter. She chalks up that line of thinking to her paranoia, but I personally find this to be way too sketchy to just be conjecture. I think she may know what's really in there. We also can't forget her relationship with Asgore. We know they're at the very least friends in this universe, as he gives her plenty of flowers, and she returns to favor with comic books. But she never talks about why they're apparently spending time together on a somewhat regular basis. So, what if she's working for him, just like in Undertale? We know Asgore's cooking up something with a black shard, and all signs point to him being familiar with Dark World shenanigans. And whatever he's working on is being supported by Rudy and Carol, both financially and emotionally emotionally. By financially, I mean they're keeping his flower shop open, but I don't think they'd be doing that if they weren't invested in his quest to clear his name and presumably save their daughter. Why is this important? Well, Alphys is new in town and was apparently hired at the school thanks to Toriel, who we know doesn't support Asgore's endeavors. What if Asgore is the reason Alphys moved to town? What if she is still a scientist in this world, though one who's looking for her big break? What if Asgore hired her to help him research Dark Worlds and pull off whatever he's working towards? And Toriel, not wanting Alphys to get wrapped up in what she thinks is a lost cause, hooked her up with a teaching job at the school, hoping she'd be too occupied with the students to indulge Asgore in his crazy conspiracies. But perhaps when the last bell rings and the kids head home, Alphys goes right back to work on her big experiment with Asgore. Why? Because just like how her Undertale counterpart wanted to insert herself in Frisk's adventure for validation and to convince Frisk to stay in the underground, this Alphys wants to play a role in reuniting the Dreamer and Holiday families to prove Asgore's innocence and also reap the benefits of the Dark World, like hot anime babes. But again, Deltarune is a story where plenty of characters are hiding secrets from each other, which is why I think the OG queen of that will definitely be relevant. Even if she and Asgore are on the same page, I think she'd likely be unaware of what characters like the Knight or Carol have up their sleeves. To them, she's just another misguided pawn like Queen and Tenna. Now here's the thing, if Alphys is working with Asgore to study Dark Worlds, then I believe it'd only be natural for a scientist like her to have concerns over too many Dark Fountains being opened at the same time. Coupling this with the likelihood of her stumbling upon the prophecy during her research, which I think is pretty high since again, it's being taught in the church, so it's pretty accessible, she might have realized that the price of working with Asgore is triggering the roaring. So, similar to Undertale Alphys, she takes a gamble and tries to set the prophecy in motion just as a contingency plan. Maybe she's still working with Asgore and is just hoping he won't find out. Maybe he's in on it and wants Kris to embark on this epic adventure, or maybe Alphys just quit the project, wishing Asgore the best of luck but not wanting to be involved any further, leaving them in a place where there's no bad blood and they're still on good terms. I think Asgore would be pretty understanding, especially with her teaching job in the equation. Depending on how much she knows about the prophecy, if the light world details the three heroes being a human, a monster, and a prince of dark, or if she somehow got access to the Dark World's version of the prophecy, it wouldn't be hard for her to pinpoint Kris as the human and the Dark Prince being some sort of darkner. All she has to do is figure out who the monster is. And given that this is a pretty small town, she wouldn't have a ton of candidates to comb through, eventually narrowing it down to Susie. They appear to live in the same apartment complex, so they likely interact in and out of school, allowing Alphys to observe her character more than the average resident of hometown gets to. Plus, to be frank, Deltarune loves its jokes, so it wouldn't surprise me if Alphys being a total nerd enabled her to crack the code and assign Susie as the monster in the prophecy. A delinquent and social outcast who's actually destined for greatness and ends up saving the world?
That's just like Naruto!
Alphys, having a greater understanding of Susie's home life and being familiar with the legend of Deltarune, knows that Susie has the capacity to be the hero that the prophecy speaks of. It's just a matter of putting the monster on the right path. She believes in Susie and wants to root for her, kinda like in Undertale and how that Alphys found it hard not to root for Frisk when she was watching their journey. Having her suspects figured out, Alphys just had to wait for the perfect occasion to put her theory in motion, which ended up being the missing chalk. Alphys was adamant on setting Kris to get the chalk with Susie, which I find to be strange, given how Noelle was clearly volunteering herself when planning the idea. Tough luck, kid. I think Alphys was aware of the Dark World in the closet, thanks to her partnership with Asgore, and sent Kris and Susie to receive some chalk, knowing they'd fall in. If everything worked out, then the prophecy to save the two worlds would begin to unfold. Alphys is also the only one who could briefly leave the classroom without looking suspicious, having the alibi of checking on the chalk quest, but really, she just needs to trap some kids in the closet. This would also explain why Alphys is so nervous in just about every interaction you have with her in the game. It's more than her social awkwardness and anxiety. She even seems more anxious talking to Kris than she ever did with Frisk, aside from when Mettaton was bailing on her staged obstacles. She says she was really worried when Susie and Kris didn't come back to class, because again, she knows what Dark Worlds are, but she doesn't pry for their whereabouts, and in fact, she's pretty quick to move on, which is pretty weird and irresponsible, and I think goes beyond her being a pushover. Maybe she was hoping Kris would come clean about the Dark World so that she could reveal everything that she knows, but since Kris and Susie are keeping it a secret, Alphys decided to just let it be and let things unfold the way that they're meant to. There's also the fact that Alphys shows some concern towards Kris and Susie's friendship despite being the one responsible for bringing them together in the first place, which I think could fit in with her knowing about the prophecy. We, as the player, don't know what the final tragedy is, but apparently Susie finds it absurd, as none of the three would let it happen. Gerson's words to Susie after his secret boss fight also might imply that Susie's role in the prophecy may not necessarily be that of a hero, or that at least she can be whoever she chooses to be, not what the prophecy tells her to be. And once again, Caddy with an eye sees a darkness within Susie, but that just might be jealousy. Still, if Susie is a wild card in the prophecy, or if her actions lead to the final tragedy in the prophecy, then it makes sense why Alphys, while hoping for the best, would still want Kris to know that she's looking out for them, even if she thinks she can't really do anything. Which I definitely think is a layered statement. Yeah, maybe she might just be another person afraid of Susie, but if she knows about the prophecy, she may believe that everything is destined to happen regardless of what she does. Which is why I think this reveal could have a meaningful impact on the story and serve a purpose beyond shock value or making another Undertale character relevant. It ties back into the idea that your choices don't matter in a way that both feeds into it and actively challenges the notion. It feels like we're approaching a low point in the story. With the prophecy looming over our heroes, I could see Susie starting to feel hopeless about actually being able to subvert it, feeling as if her choices don't matter because it's all predetermined, right? Something that would be reinforced by discovering that someone else chose to send her into the dark world. But sooner than later, she would realize that's not true. That Alphys made the decision to take a chance on Susie and send her into the dark world, and it worked out. That choice did matter. Once Susie arrived in Castletown, she felt compelled to be the villain, refusing to believe that she was capable of being good. But then she made the choice to be a hero, to take a chance on herself, and it kept working out. She kept evolving and growing as a person in so many different ways. I think it's obvious at this point that the prophecy can be subverted, or at least it's not as concrete as it first may seem. After all, it said Tenna was destined to be cleaved by Red, and while the Roaring Knight did slice his arms off, his fate is ultimately still up to your actions, as you can either have him recruited into Castletown, gifted to Mettaton, or just flat out abandoned. It's all about the importance of taking initiative. Like taking the initiative to trap 2 potential heroes of legend in a magic closet. I hope I've made a decent case for why I think Alphys has more going on than meets the eye, and why she might have been the one who trapped Kris and Susie in the school closet. With all that said, let me know who you think trapped Kris and Susie in the closet in the comments down below, even if you think it was no one and that this video was a waste of time.